Hello there, and welcome to a brand new Digital Foundry Switch 2 video. In this one, we're going to be concentrating on what I think is a really interesting release, Hogwarts Legacy. It's a game that initially arrived on PlayStation 5, Xbox, and PC, boasting some pretty astonishing visuals, I'd say. But over time, the success of the game meant that it was actually ported to a range of platforms. So at one end, we have like a high-end PC with all those ray tracing features. And at the other end, we've got the original Switch 1 version of the game, which was certainly an interesting experience. But Switch 2, where does that kind of sit within the lineup of available platforms? Or is it something completely new? Oliver Mackenzie, you've done all of the legwork on this one. I'm really interested to see what you've come up with here.
Yes, we don't have a ton of footage to work off of here, but I think we have enough to reach some interesting kind of tentative findings here.
Okay, so where do we begin?
Yeah, so I thought we'd start today with Series S and move down the stack a bit, because I think to explain what this port potentially is, I think we need to explain what it isn't first. And just for context, we have about 2.5 minutes of footage between a creator's voice segment that Nintendo published a couple weeks ago, and they also published an additional roughly a minute of Switch 1 versus Switch 2 footage, direct lineups from Nintendo, which is also very helpful here. In comparing the Series S here, I'm using Series S in fidelity mode because unfortunately the performance mode is bugged at the moment. It has very inconsistent animation between frames. It's the same issue that we saw in the Series S version of Ghost Runner and the High on Life release on the Xbox Series machines. But the two Series S modes are pretty similar outside of resolution. So yeah, I just did not want to introduce that one bit of inconsistency there, because it does look quite horrible, I would say, on the Series S performance mode. I'm not sure for how long it's been broken there, but yeah, it's not so great. So Hogwarts Legacy is kind of an unusual game and maybe kind of an old school game in that a lot of the core assets and world design are totally different between its various incarnations. Like you said, famously the Switch 1 at its worst end and something like a PlayStation 5 or Series X at the top end there, or certainly the PC version. And I think we see some of that when we compare Series S to Switch 2 here. So we're seeing a lot of asset differences between Series S and Switch. So I think a good area to view this in is the Hogwarts Common Room, the Gryffindor Common Room rather. If we look here, for instance, there's a table in the corner. It's a squared off dark brown table, right? If you can see there in that zoom in. On Series S, it's a lighter circular table, presumably with a lot more geometry, even though we see that the table only occupies a very small amount of screen space there. You can see that the tables are different tables, and that is indeed one of the key asset differences we see across the various versions of Hogwarts Legacy, is that there are these asset differences where they've actually gone out. It's not just a worse slot. It's not just a, less detailed version of what they had otherwise. It's actually a completely different model that is sort of trying to get a bit of a different compromise in terms of the polygonal budget of the item versus its perceived graphical fidelity, right, for a weaker platform. So that's kind of interesting. When you look at the fire here, there's a big shadow of the grate on Series S. On Switch 2, not so much, it seems. The fire also looks a bit more voluminous. And the rug on the floor is a simple flat texture on Switch 2 here, but on Series S it has some humps and it isn't laid totally against the ground flat there. In this shot of the Gryffindor Common Room as well, you can see that all the rugs on Switch 2 use different assets from their Series S counterparts. If you look towards especially the bottom left of the screen and bottom middle of the screen, you should be able to see there that those are different assets. And then if we move over to the shot in the teaching building, if you look at the stone columns on the left-hand side of the picture here, Switch 2 has less geometry on those columns and has lower resolution textures, which is a fairly obvious difference. Moving over to this shot in Ollivander's, which is like the wand shop in Hogsmeade, the globe above the main character is missing on Switch 2, and it's present on the Series S fidelity mode there. And then in this shot, you can notice how the stones are blended into the dirt with maybe a more elegant layering of materials in Series S, whereas on Switch 2 they do jut out a bit. There are also some things that aren't necessarily asset related, but do seem kind of like they're stemming from, in general, a different settings preset maybe than the Series S is using. Because like if you look at the shadow maps in this shot, on Series S, the shadow maps appear to update every frame for this environmental shadow, but on Switch 2 it occurs somewhat less often. It looks a little bit odd, but it does help to minimize shadow map aliasing a little bit there, because that less persistent update between frames, it's not causing so many jaggies there in motion. And there's also a bit of a lowered shadow resolution, nothing crazy, but a little bit of a lower shadow resolution. But there are a lot of shots here that I could go through where they do look pretty similar. I think that's especially the case if you're looking at some of these more broad overview type shots, like if you're not looking up close at certain assets, the differences don't stand out as much. But I think in the limited number of shots we do have where we are able to analyze some detail up close, we do see some of those differences, which is kind of like, again, where you tend to see that split in the various versions of Hogwarts Legacy. It's really in the up close detail, especially between current gen and last gen consoles. But moving on to those last gen consoles, I actually thought that the Switch 2 version reminded me quite a bit of the PlayStation 4 incarnation of the game. So if we go back to the Gryffindor Common Room on PS4, all the divergences we saw between Series S and Switch 2 are basically gone. You know, the rugs and the carpet are the same between PS4 and Switch 2. There's no really defined shadow cast by the grate in front of the fire there. The table in the corner, the same squared off table, right, in both versions. It's the same kind of squared off table there. It looks really, really similar. In the wand shop, the globe is missing in both versions. And in the opening sequence, the ground textures look very similar there. Also, the shadow maps appear at about a similar resolution, and they also update at a bit of a staggered rate there. They're not updating on every refresh. But there are some differences, like in that odd little shot in the teaching building. If you look at the stone pillar on the left, in this shot, it actually does appear high resolution on PlayStation 4 for some reason, which is a little bit of an odd change, but, you know, a little bit anomalous here for sure. And in this shot, there's a little bit of more texture detail in the Switch 2 in the upper left-hand corner of this wall here, which is certainly something that is a little bit more indicative of a Series S setting in this instance. So there's some differences there between the various versions. I think the key area of interest in this trailer is this shot in the trailer, for me at least, which is of these two walkways at Hogwarts. So if you look at the walkways here, there's one that's kind of a blue walkway with blue stained glass, and there's another walkway with green stained glass beneath it. And then obviously the position of the character is another third walkway, which has no obstruction to it, right, in the Switch 2 footage.
Got it.
Now, if we replicate this shot on PS4, it's actually impossible to replicate because the walkway that is present on Switch, that's an open walkway, is actually totally blocked off on PS4. And if I push the camera outside this area with the photo mode, you can see that the walkways on PS4 have that same obstruction, have the same stained glass they do on Switch 2, but it's actually, you have this additional obstruction where you can't even see them on PS4. So that is a high level of a kind of occlusion there. But if I bring back the Series S for a moment, you can actually replicate the Switch 2 shot, except that the two walkways are totally open. You can see into them, and you should be able to see out of them, and you can also see a structure behind them. Like, I think it's the Great Hall behind them. On Switch 2, I guess they presume you're just not going to notice that that structure is omitted, even though, you know, you could be able to see it on Switch 2, even with the coverings there. So this is a really, really key optimization that was made for the last gen console versions and also Switch, where they block off more of the level in these open shots to minimize streaming and keep less assets resident in RAM. Here, the Switch 2 seems to be somewhere in the middle between these two platforms with, you know, 2/3 the walkways blocked off on Switch 2, as opposed to the PlayStation 4 where they're blocking off all the walkways, and on Series S where they're blocking off none of the walkways. So I thought that was kind of an interesting little detail there. So overall, I mean, I think that the game on Switch 2 seems a lot closer to the PS4 release in terms of the kinds of asset compromises they've made in general, but it's not a straight port of the PS4 settings. There's some stuff that matches Series S a little bit more, and I could see the developers maybe taking that PS4 approach as a base and then upgrading it maybe selectively to take advantage of the Switch 2. Obviously, that the fact that walkway is uncovered seems like a fairly intentional choice. It does not seem like something that would have just done incidentally. It seems like kind of a recognition that maybe the system can actually pull off a little bit more streaming in that moment, and they can actually get those assets resident in RAM in the way that they couldn't on the PlayStation 4, perhaps. So that's one, I think that's my general takeaway here. But there's one important thing to note that I'm not quite sure what to make of as well, which is that the Switch 2 version is only 24 gigabytes in size, according to the Switch eShop listing, while the PS4 is like, I think, 55 gigabytes. So it's possible there's a lot of asset duplication there. It's also possible that the Switch 2 version might have some different compression settings and things like this, but that is an odd change, I would say. And then and then as one kind of final note here, you know, regardless of whatever platform you're comparing the Switch 2 to, I think it's very clear that it looks a lot better than the Switch 1 version.
Right.
And
Yes, that was going to be my question about
yeah,
that, because obviously that was like the lowest rung on the ladder, so to speak.
yeah. So it looks a lot better than Switch 1, I would say. Nintendo actually put together some Switch 1 versus Switch 2 assets, which I think they're generally representative of the differences, but I don't think that the capture is totally representative of the way that the Switch 1 version works. Because if you look at a comparison between Nintendo's Switch 1 capture and our Switch 1 capture here, you can see that the Nintendo Switch 1 capture looks oddly a little bit washed out. In my own capture, I think it looks fine, and it measures up, comparably to the other versions in terms of contrast, in terms of saturation, in terms of those elements. So that is a little bit of an odd note here. But even using Nintendo's assets, I think you can see here that the image quality, the performance, the lighting quality, everything has been greatly improved relative to Switch 1. When you go back to that Switch 1 version, there were so many changes that were made for that version of the game. So many changes even to just like the structure of the environment, to the environmental geometry everywhere in the open world. There were so many new loading screens that were introduced. It was a different game visually, different game structurally. It looked like it was on a completely different generation of console hardware, and performance didn't measure up that well either. So I think here what we're seeing is a game that looks like pretty confidently like Hogwarts Legacy, and obviously much, much better than that Switch 1 version of the game, which is certainly very encouraging to see, because I was not a huge fan of that Switch 1 version, I have to say.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I'm kind of curious about this. I mean, on the face of it, it's exactly what you'd expect, right? A version of the game that sits between the last gen and the current gen versions to a certain extent. It's going to be interesting to see when we have a lot more footage to look at, when we actually have hands-on experience of the game, just what kind of balance they've gone for here. But what I'm really interested in, and what I find is actually really to the credit of the developer, is that they could have just cut down the original version of the game. They could have savagely cut it back. But, the fact that they went in and actually created new assets that are actually, more complementary to the performance level of the last gen systems, I think is a huge credit to them. And I think, the fact that they've essentially got two sets of assets that they can draw upon for the new version of the game for Switch 2 possibly opens up some interesting possibilities for them. And I'm going to be interested to see how it all pans out. Now, I did play the game, or rather, Tom played the game, actually, thinking about it at the London event. And I did watch him play it, and it looked okay. Obviously, it didn't quite have the same sort of degree of splendor as the game running on a PC or PS5 Series X. But, I think it did the job based on what I saw. I think the thing that concerned me a bit was when there was complex geometry, there were performance drops. So that hopefully was a work in progress version of the game. We just have to wait and see what the final version looks like.
Yeah.
And that was actually running docked. We didn't actually get to see the handheld version of the game. All of which leads us on to disclosures that have come about since that event and since the original Direct, which have some interesting detail in them, right?
Yeah, I would say the detail here is interesting, if just because in large part they kind of contradict a little bit of the visual evidence that we have on screen, and I'll explain that in a moment here. But Sega, they're putting out this game in Japan. They're publishing this game in Japan. And they put out a press release a few days ago on 4Gamer, which is a prominent Japanese publication. And they mentioned a few things here. They mentioned that they're going to reach a 1440p resolution docked and 1080p in portable mode. And they mentioned that DLSS is in use as well, apparently. So that certainly is lining up to be I would say, pretty complementary set of figures and technologies for a Switch 2 release of this kind of game, I would say. But that doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me, because internally, like we mentioned a number of DF Directs ago, it counts at 720p, it appears, in docked footage. And it also counts for me in this footage that we do have here at 720p or thereabouts. Again, a lot of the edges that I'm counting here are pretty short edges because it's compressed footage. I only have so much ability to find edges, but it looks like it's about 720p, quite close to 720p at least. And it looks a bit soft, I would say. It looks a little bit messy. There's some breakup and some raw edges, especially when there's complex movement. In more stationary shots, it actually looks pretty good. But when there's like complex movement, like when the characters are running around or firing spells at each other with their wands. That is like movement that inherently has a ton of disocclusion to it, and it just kind of causes all kinds of artifacts, and that's not too good. So I actually thought I'd pull up the PC version here and just compare it to what we would expect from something like DLSS on PC. And whether at 1080p output or 1440p output or 720p output, all at 720p internally, DLSS is much smoother. It has much less issues with disocclusion in this shot, which is a very complex shot of kind of the opening of the game. It's just much better behaved. Now, we don't know whether the Switch's DLSS is based on the Transformer model or the CNN model. So for these initial comparisons, I'm using DLSS 3.8, which I've kind of injected into the game with DLSS Swapper. But you can see in these comparisons with DLSS 4, the Transformer model, that is the default model present in the game, that it's giving a fairly similar visual result, and I would say a much better visual result than the Switch 2 version here. And it also does not look very much like TAA at 720p either. But it also does not look very much like FSR 3 at 720p internal, whether it's going to, 1080p or 1440p here. It does not look very much like that either. And I would say that FSR 3 looks substantially better in these shots. I think that some of the image quality characteristics that we're seeing from Switch 2 in these shots do remind me of FSR, but maybe remind me of FSR and kind of its lesser performing incarnations, where it's giving you a little bit more of that fizzle, a little bit more of that disocclusion. It's not giving you a super smooth image presentation in this kind of complex movement. So exactly what's going on here, I don't know. Relative to PC DLSS, it does not look very much like it at all. It's possible that the game might be using DLSS, let's say in one mode, and that another mode might not be using DLSS. It's also a possibility that the press release is just mistaken. We have not seen a corresponding English language press release, I will note here, only one from Sega in Japan, so perhaps there's a bit of a miscommunication about the game's capabilities. And of course, 1440p, when they express a 1440p resolution, that could mean a number of things, right? That could mean that they're doing the HUD at 1440p. It could mean that the resolution they're upsampling to is 1440p. It could mean any number of things. It could just mean that, they're saying that that's the maximum output you can do in like a 40 hertz, 40 FPS mode or something, right? There are a million possibilities there in terms of what they could be suggesting. So yeah, that's a bit of a question mark. I'd be curious to see exactly how that pans out in the final release. But in terms of frame rates here, just scanning through the footage, they do appear to be targeting 30 FPS. I know there was some unlocked footage that they published earlier that does not seem to be representative of the final product here. They do seem to be targeting 30 FPS. And that makes a lot of sense. 30 FPS is a level where this game is most consistent, even on current gen consoles. And then obviously on last gen consoles, it's also a 30 FPS title. So I'd suggest that's probably pretty reasonable. But yeah, just some interesting quirks with regards to image quality. I don't think we have enough footage here to really make a dispositive claim about it. And again, perhaps the situation will change. I just found that a curious little detail that they're suggesting the game is using DLSS, when in fact, in my own reading, and indeed in Alex's reading as well, I showed him the assets, it does not look like DLSS in any of the footage that we've seen of this game so far.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. I mean, the other thing about a 1440p target is that the computational cost of DLSS goes up quite significantly versus doing it at 1080p, which obviously has an impact on the amount of GPU resources available for other things. So I'm going to be interested to see how that all sort of works out when we see the final game. I can't really say that any of the footage we've seen actually presents in a way that's representative of a 1440p presentation, though.
No.
So, yeah, I think that's the bottom line, right? Which is kind of the point of DLSS, if you like, in the first place. In terms of FSR, I mean, famously, the original Hogwarts Legacy release was FSR 1, wasn't it? But I don't think that's definitely not what we're seeing here. It does seem to have a sort of temporal component, because you can see it on those disocclusion artifacts there, which you wouldn't see if there wasn't a temporal component involved. Could this be the mythical lightweight DLSS? Who knows? I'm not aware of such a thing existing at the moment, to be honest. But who knows? It's still early days, right? Any final notes on this before we wrap up?
Well, there was one comment that came out of this press release that I know people have been kind of attaching themselves to and thinking about here, which is they mentioned that Hogwarts Legacy will have reduced loading times on Switch 2 and no explicit loading screens within the open world. So I think that's an interesting detail and something that I wanted to kind of walk through briefly exactly what the implications of that are, because we do see some examples of that in Switch 2 preview footage, where there's a loading screen to enter Hogsmeade on Switch 1, but on Switch 2 it's seamless. So that would bring it up at least to the level of the last generation consoles and current generation consoles that do not have a segmented world between Hogsmeade and the rest of the open world. But I would think that leaving Hogwarts for the open world will probably still be segmented with a loading screen, because that's the case on every console version except for the PS5 and Series X releases. So only those versions are truly like loading screen free once you load into the game, absent fast travel. All the other versions have at least some level of segmentation, and then the last generation console versions have an additional level of segmentation relative to Series S, and then Switch 1 has an additional level of segmentation relative to last gen console. So it's not quite clear to me where it would fall in the loading screen continuum here. Again, I would presume that it probably won't be much of a distinction in actual practice. I don't think the loading screens will be a major issue. I don't think they were like a colossal issue on PlayStation 4, and so it could only be, significantly better on Switch 2, I'd imagine, with the decompression engine, the FDE, with the
and faster media, of course, isn't running from a mechanical hard drive.
Exactly, much faster media. I would presume that it would be a much faster experience. Then, of course, it's only 24 gigabytes of assets. I don't know exactly what that means in practice, but that can only mean good things probably for potentially loading those assets.
Yeah, I think there's basically two things to it. First of all, there's the streaming technology available, and then secondly, there's the memory available. Obviously, the current gen versions of Hogwarts have access to much more memory, but at the same time, they're streaming more data. Based on your comparisons here. So yeah, I mean, you've got a Series S point to make here, right? I mean, that's what you're suspecting is kind of how Series S landed, right?
Yes, Series S had a segmented, had a full loading screen break between Hogwarts and the open world, and I presume there that what you're running into is probably a RAM limitation, right? Mm-hmm. Because why would PS5 and Series X not have to have that loading screen, but Series S has to have that loading screen? Presumably they can't fit all those assets resident in RAM at one time. They have to break and give the player a loading screen in place of a short like door loading animation.
Well, it's been quite interesting to see that Hogwarts Legacy has basically been one of these games that's almost like a benchmark game in a kind of curious way, because they've managed somehow to make it run across so many different systems. And, basically now you've got a sort of indication of what level of hardware is capable of what level of assets and what kind of experience you're going to get. So we've got an interesting sort of mini preview as to where Switch 2 sits here. But I think, the jury's still out on the overall package, and we'll just have to wait for the final game to see where it actually lands.
Yeah, I would definitely say so. I think that this game is very interesting in the sense that we don't see very many games that are so comprehensively changed for different platforms like this one. I think one recent analog would be a title like the port of like Wolfenstein 2 to Nintendo Switch, where they blocked off certain parts of the level with different like walls and things like that to reduce the strain on the Switch's GPU. I remember that was one prominent instance, but in this case, they really have gone whole hog in making bespoke versions of this game for different platforms. And it seems like on Switch 2, they are mostly sticking with the PlayStation, roughly in that kind of PlayStation 4 area. But we'll have to see the final game in particular in terms of those load times and in terms of the kinds of potential breaks or segmentation they have in the world. I would presume it's not going to be very much there. But yeah, just some interesting details here. I think the image quality side of it to me is most interesting at the moment. But I would be very curious to see how the final version of the game holds up with respect to all of its graphical elements and the various console platforms we can compare it to. But overall, I think the takeaway here is fairly positive. If you're coming from the Switch 1 version, I think it's a pretty tremendous improvement over that Switch 1 version in terms of the, every single visual detail you can pick out here, basically.
Good stuff. Okay, so obviously once Switch 2 lands, we're going to be taking a look at as many of the games as we can. But I'm just looking at the list of launch titles here, and there's going to be a lot to get through. But I think we are going to give Hogwarts Legacy the due it deserves here. It's just a question of when. But with that, I guess that's it. So thanks for that, Oliver.
Yeah, likewise. It was a pleasure.
So yeah, there's going to be a huge amount of games that we're going to have to get through during the launch period. But yeah, we'll certainly be taking a good look at the final version of Hogwarts Legacy. But that's all from us on this one. Like, subscribe, share if you feel like it, ring bells for notifications. And yes, please do consider the DF supporter program. But that's all from us on this one. Thanks for watching and supporting Digital Foundry.